Thank you, Bob. My name is Michel Degg, Chair of National Cattle Feeders. We thank the provincial government tonight for their added contribution to the set-aside programs. We have been working with our members across the country to ensure that all provincially run set-aside programs are launched effectively. At the same time, we continue to work at the federal level with our national partners and other support and resources for cattle feeders and producers across the country. Last week, we presented to the Agriculture Standing Committee, sharing with the government the impact that COVID has had on our industry and discussing our needs moving forward. While the beef industry and our supply chain work to return to full capacity, we give exceptional thanks to the processors and the employees in the packing plants working so hard. Your efforts are appreciated as a vital part of the supply chain, and we wish you the best as you work safely. Thank you to the processor for your quick adaptation and focus on employees' health and food safety, and thank you to the employees for your dedication to providing Canadians with a safe and healthy food. Maintenant, quelques mots en français. Alors, merci aux gouvernements provinciaux pour leur contribution au programme de mise de côté ou set-aside. On a travaillé avec nos membres d'un bout à l'autre du pays pour que le programme puisse être lancé partout. En même temps, nous continuons de travailler avec tous nos partenaires canadiens pour mettre en place d'autres mesures de soutien pour nos éleveurs. La semaine dernière, la NCFA a fait une présentation devant la Commission permanente de l'agriculture à Ottawa pour échanger avec le gouvernement de l'impact de la COVID a eu sur notre industrie et discuter des besoins urgents qui ne sont toujours pas comblés pour les éleveurs. Alors, pendant que la chaîne d'approvisionnement de l'industrie bovine met tout en œuvre pour un retour à la pleine capacité, je dois dire un merci exceptionnel à nos exploitants et nos travailleurs d'usines d'abattage et de découpe pour leur travail et leur dévouement exceptionnel. Tous vos efforts sont très appréciés de notre part. À vous, Michel.
Michelle?
Yes, Bob?
Can I step in for just 1 minute? I think we probably should welcome the Alberta beef producers, Kelly Fraser and Rich Smith, and the Beef Farmers of Ontario, Rob Lipsett, to this producers panelist group.
That's great. Thanks for that, Bob. So as Bob just mentioned, tonight we will be receiving some updates. The first one will be from Rick Wright, Executive Administrator at the Livestock Markets Association of Canada, followed by Dennis Laycraft, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. We will also receive updates from Kelly Smith-Fraser, Chair of the Alberta Beef Producers, and Rob Lipsett, President of the Beef Farmers of Ontario. Following these updates, we will open the floor up to questions from producers. We will limit the duration of this entire presentation to 1 hour. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. Please include your name and your province with your question. Please be advised that we will not be taking questions from the chat function. I will now give the floor to Rick, Dennis, Kelly, and Rob.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And I'm Rick Wright from the Livestock Markets Association of Canada. Going to do just a recap of what happened in our markets in the last week. And on the fed cattle trade this week, well, to say it was volatile would be a major understatement. In the last 7 days, we saw a huge price spike in the fed cattle market. It all started to come together last Thursday. We saw Ontario packers were in Manitoba and Saskatchewan prospecting for cattle, and their bids at $232 dressed. Delivered to Ontario with quicker kill dates, looked fairly attractive to the feeders with market-ready cattle on hand. They got a few cattle bought in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and by Friday, their bids had dropped down to $224 delivered to Ontario. Now, at the same time, there was more demand from the American packers for Alberta-fed cattle, with lots of loads being sold to go south at higher money than was bid in Western Canada. So by after the long weekend on Tuesday, the East bids had gone up to $260 dress delivered to Ontario, with the Western packers starting to increase their harvest numbers. The fight was on. It was like the shootout at the OK Corral. By Wednesday, the West was bidding $2.50 delivered. The East was up to $2.65. Now, in 1 week, we saw the East jump their bids by 33 cents per pound dressed on the rail. And of course, everybody was asking with the 40-cent jump in the West, why this was happening, how long was it going to last, and what happened to the 130 to 150,000 cattle that were supposed to be backlogged into the system. Now, really, the only one that can answer that question truthfully is the packers, but the opinion on the street is that we hit a gap in the supply between the fed yearlings and the heavy fed calves. The yearlings pretty much ran out of the inventory, and the packers were reaching out to find those long fed cattle that have a superior grade and yield. And the bulk of the calves that were put on feed last fall are probably 45 to 60 days away from being market ready. So how long will it last? Well, the Eastern packers were bidding for immediate delivery. And I mean immediate delivery. I bought some fed steers on Tuesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They were loaded Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock for this Friday's kill. On Wednesday, I sold some fed heifers into one of the Western packers, and they're going to go to the plant about June 5th. So that's weeks. As the packers increase their weekly kill numbers, the short-term demand has probably surpassed the short-term supply on the good end fed, hard-fed cattle. But this can only be temporary. Canfax reported last week on Brian's report that we had 100,000 more cattle on feed in January than the previous year. Now, we've not had a large number of exports of feeder cattle to the U.S. in the first quarter, so we can expect a large volume of fed cattle to be available in July and onward. You know, the backlog hasn't gone away. As a matter of fact, probably the tidal wave of deliveries is on the horizon. Packers on both sides of the border, as they get back to normal harvest numbers, the supply that they offer to the retailers and wholesalers will grow, and it might be harder for the box beef prices to hold close to the current levels. If they drop off, you can probably expect the rail grade and live prices to follow suit. The cow markets for this week, they were steady the past week. It looks like the sale barn deliveries of 150 to 250 cows per sale is the amount that the market can absorb and hold the prices. Buyers this week, a little more fussy on those plain end cows with discounts on the softer, poor fed yielding cows. Provincial abattoirs and the smaller plants seem to reach their processing capabilities. And that's allowing a few more cows to go to the south. Now, one interesting note, and we just picked it up at the end of the business day today, was the reappearance of one of the major Alberta packers buying cows at the auction. Their participation in the one sale that I watched in Manitoba pretty well took the American packers off the market. So if the Western packers are starting to kill some cows, or starting to put some away, that should keep the market fairly firm and allow for some additional deliveries over the next couple of weeks. But I would check with your local sale barn before I took in any big numbers. Good cows traded this week from 80 to 85 cents. There was some regional differences depending on the freight. There was an increased demand for some good feeding cows to hold over and some heiferettes to go out to breed. There were a few orders starting to surface on those one and done cows. Now, those are kind of cows that are in calf that the fellows will end up buying, calving out on the grass. They'll harvest the cow in the fall and put the calf on feed. Bull market, once again, really strong from 110 to 125 with sales to $1.30, depending on what region you were in. Last week, good bulls were selling higher than good fed steers. That's not the case this week, but nevertheless, the demand for the bulls was very strong. We move over to the feeder cattle at the market. So in the past week from BC straight through to Ontario, we sold 35,000 cattle. That was down 1,000 cattle from the previous week. There was also some solid regional differences in deliveries. BC was up 1,200 cattle from the week prior. Alberta was up 3,900 cattle. Saskatchewan down 4,000. Manitoba was up 900, and Ontario was down 3,200 cattle from the week before. Just out of interest sake, we flipped the pages in the history book and we go back to last year. We sold about 1,330 cattle less this year for the same week last year. BC was down 1,600. Alberta was up 4,000. Saskatchewan down 500. Manitoba down 700. And Ontario was down 2,300 compared to the same week last year. For the second week in a row, demand for the feeder cattle outlasted the supply that we had. This week we saw more demand from Alberta feedlots for sure on all classes of cattle. Ontario and Quebec feedlots were very aggressive on the top quality feeders, especially those 800 to 850 pound steer calves. We saw more action on the 900 pound plus cattle this week, and we even saw in one electronic sales a few steers that were weighing over the 1,000 pounds found their way into Ontario at a pretty good price. All those classes of cattle on the steers especially were 2 to 3 higher again this week. and very short supplies on offer. Demand for the good quality feeder cattle on the heifers increased this week, especially on those 750 to 900 pound cattle. It looked like some of the feedlots were having trouble sourcing steers and turned their attention to the heifers. There was a little limited demand for replacement heifers, and with that added competition, we saw higher prices from $5 to $7 a hundredweight on the good end of the heifers. Keep in mind, those fleshy and moderate frame heifers were still being discounted. Lightweight cattle, again, fully steady to strong. They're bulletproof, those cattle. We saw the 700-pound steers trading from 195 to 205. We saw six weights at 205 to 218. The 500-pound steers from 225 to 250, with the regional differences taken into consideration. Heifers running 20 to 25% or cents per pound behind the steers on a larger offer of heifers this week compared to the steers. Grass cattle expected to get turned out from now over the next couple of weeks, but we think the lightweight cattle will still stay strong and deliveries are going to get lighter for sure. This time of year, we get a lot of calls on forward contracts. Is there contracts out there for yearlings or for calves, or what do we expect is going to happen in the fall? And we're seeing a few of those offerings being popped up, especially on electronic sales. The past week, Alberta had some 1,000-pound heifers for delivery in October. They brought $1.68. The 950-pound yearling heifers in Alberta for October delivery brought $1.6525. Out of Manitoba, we had steers offered for September delivery that brought $179.75, and the heifers off the same ranch at 850 pounds sold for $166.75. Few calves traded. The biggest bunches coming out of BC. Good soggy steer calves weighing 700 pounds for October delivery brought $2 a pound, which is a pretty good price considering where they were located in BC for the freight. And that's about what they were bringing, on average across the board this week. The baby sisters at 650 pounds sold for $1.8075. Just before I wrap up, I'd like to just mention the producers seem to be pretty happy with the announcement to extend the WLPIP deadline on the calves to June 18th. That was an ask from CCA and was well received by the producers that we've talked to. The futures have not recovered the losses that have happened over the last 2 weeks for the calf and feeder contracts. But if you want to take a look at what they expect to happen, CanFax had a webinar last night, or CattleFax rather, out of the US had a webinar last night, and their prediction were steady prices for this fall. They were talking 550-pound calves at $1.55 US. That would put them about on today's exchange around the 215. On the 800-pound yearlings, they were talking at 137 American, converted to about $1.90 Canadian, 800 pounds. They predicted the backlog of fed cattle would influence the market on both sides of the border well into the fourth quarter, and that they felt might negatively affect the feeder cattle prices this fall. If their prediction is right, and the unpredictable status of COVID-19, producers maybe in the West should take a second look at that. I was told a long time ago by a very wise cattle producer that optimism is contagious, and if it's left unchecked, it'll spread like wildfire, especially in the cattle industry. And with that, I'm going to close and say, be cautious, my friends, and stay safe. And I'm going to turn the mic back to Mission Control in Calgary.
Thanks for that update, Rick. Now we'll ask Dennis for his update.
Great. Thanks, Rick, as well. Brian was unavailable today. It's kind of tough. He's had to deliver some pretty hard news on prices the last number of these town halls, and it's nice to have some improving prices to talk about as we're meeting again. I do want to, as we head into this again, recognize we work every week as the members of the beef advisors, which help oversee the national beef strategy. So we're lucky to have a great team of national organizations that are working very closely together through this. And also want to recognize regularly through the week we have policy discussions, and the provincial managers and our provincial members are very active in those discussions and are doing a lot of work behind the scenes that doesn't always get recognized as well as it probably should, but we certainly appreciate all the work that they're doing. I want to talk a bit about capacity. It was mentioned here earlier in visiting with Cargill. They're up to 3,200 head a day now. They're working their way up from that. I think they still remain optimistic that they're going to continue to get closer to full capacity as they move ahead. JBS has brought in their second shift today, so they're going to start slowly I think they're around 2,000 a day right now without the second shift, and it's going to phase in. They're thinking, probably 500 to 600, and then work their way up. So that all adds to capacity and more competitive bidding again as we move forward. And I think Harmony's sort of in the high 400s is the last we've heard from them. I think the interesting news is out of Eastern Canada. They're continuing to operate above normal capacity. And as a result, you're actually starting to see some cattle get pulled from Manitoba in particular into Ontario, and it has been reflected in the prices. As Rick mentioned, we've seen bids up to 265 out of the east and around 250 out of the west, which some cases is close to 40 cents jump on where some of the lows were. So that's obviously very welcome news. I think the other thing behind all of this, when we're starting to see that capacity continue to increase in Alberta, there was pretty well full testing of all of the employees. And it's pretty clear all of the measures that they've been putting in place, that testing went with very, very few positives. In fact, they've been going days without positives, showing that all the measures that they've put in place are clearly are working as we move forward. So it's important to the resiliency as we move ahead on that. The other thing Bob had heard and we're seeing, well, the U.S. is getting back up to about 75% capacity was the latest we've heard. In the Northwest, they seem to be moving ahead of that more quickly, which again, I think we'll continue to see more live animals moving south, as well as seeing our capacity increase in Western Canada, and hopefully we maintain that brisk pace in Eastern Canada. So with that has certainly helped on prices. Was mentioned the U.S. and some of the press conference with President Trump. Fawn will be on this call, so later on, if there are questions around that, we did quickly engage with NCBA, and Bob talked to their president. We've been working with our government and as well through the embassy, and we're also reaching out to the state associations. It's anything like that you don't want to take for granted, particularly in an election year. The other thing that is coming up with different efforts, you're seeing senators and I'll call kind of the usual suspects trying to push country of origin labeling. Again, we're working very actively with our allies there to make sure that we're staying in front of that. There's always a risk when people are distracted on another issue that people try and push something through. So we continue to work very diligently on that with our allies to stay in front of it. Bob mentioned we're changing our when I say changing, we're focusing our federal ask on a few different elements right now, as we've seen some movement in the West, and I won't talk about the set aside. I think Kelly's going to talk a certain amount about that. We saw the topping up to help out on the cost of premiums in Saskatchewan for Western livestock price insurance, and we've really swung our efforts into trying to get an Eastern pilot established so we can begin in the 3 maritime provinces that are seeking it, try and get that up very quickly so that they're able to get some level of protection down there similar to what's available in the West. We're also working closely. We've had a number of we'll call fly-ins, virtual meetings with beef farmers of Ontario, and we've been working with Michelle as we're talking about the issues in Eastern Canada, both trying to get more effort into expanding capacity. As we head to the fall, they'll move into bigger numbers again, and we want to avoid what's been going on the last couple of years when their prices have been pushed down because of the capacity limitations there. So getting actively working to progress that, and as well working with their specific asks. With ag recovery, it goes province by province is the way that program works. So we're working with Ontario on their needs, and Rob will talk about that, and we'll continue to work individually with each province as we move forward. On the resiliency, we've been talking with the federal government. We had a discussion this morning with them to really focus on that. Clearly getting the plants up to full capacity or close to full capacity under this, and getting some more diversity in the plants that are out there with some expansion in the middle, and medium and small plants is still a priority. But equally important is make sure they've got all of the interventions and the personal protective equipment necessary, so that, assuming most people, myself included, believe there will be future waves of COVID-19, we want to try and make sure we've got every measure in place to make sure that doesn't cause the slowdown or the interruptions in processing that we saw during April and early May. So a lot of work is going into that. We're working with the national cattle feeders on a project with Myers Norris Penny. We're looking at taking various samples of operations, starting with cow-calf, with backgrounders and feedlots, and taking a look at the agri-stability program and what different changes to that, everything from the reference margin limit to removing the caps, to increasing the coverage or restoring the coverage back to 85%, looking at the payment trigger as well, how all those would provide actually, coverage that could be meaningful to our industry, because right now only about 1 in 4 cattle producers believe that provides useful risk management for them. But we'll continue to work on all of those, and with that, I'm going to kind of wrap up, and we're going to shift over. A lot of work's been going on in Alberta and in Saskatchewan in particular, following the announcements. And Kelly is on, so I think with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly, if that's okay, Michelle, and she can give an update on all of the activities of the work that's going on there that the Alberta beef producers are involved in.
That would be great.
Thanks, Dennis. It's great for Alberta to be involved tonight. I'm Kelly Smith-Fraser. I'm the chair of Alberta Beef Producers, and I ranch southeast of Red Deer near Pine Lake. Alberta Beef Producers works on behalf of over 18,000 cattle and beef producers across the province and across all sectors of the cattle industry. During COVID-19, ABP has been listening closely to Alberta producers and working hard to take your messages to governments through provincial and federal lobbying efforts, regular virtual meetings and calls, countless media interviews, and increased public awareness and consumers messaging that I will outline over the next few minutes. As we face this global pandemic, we are working closely with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association to bring an Alberta perspective and speak for the interests of Alberta producers. As you heard, AFSC has extended the purchase deadline for calf insurance through the Western Livestock Price Insurance Program until June 18th, 2020. And with the recent cattle market volatility, we are strongly encouraging producers to consider purchasing insurance to protect prices in the fall. Producers should be monitoring premiums and coverage levels for both calf and feeder insurance. WLPIP is a risk management tool that began as a producer-driven initiative developed under ABP's guidance to help Alberta cattle producers manage price and basis risk. More information on WLPIP, including premiums and settlement prices, can be found at www.wlpip.ca or through your local AFSC branch. As you know, operations have resumed at Cargill and High River and continue at JBS in Brooks and Harmony and Balzac. It is our understanding that Cargill is now operating at close to 75% capacity. At JBS added a shift today, and that should increase capacity to over 50%, and Harmony continues to operate around half capacity. We're thankful for those workers who keep those plants operating and express our sincere condolences to the families of those workers that have tragically lost their lives to COVID-19. Since the federal government announcement of agri-recovery funding to our industry, ABP has continued to put pressure on our provincial government, first to follow up with a commitment to the provincial portion of funding for the Fed Cattle Set-Aside program, and most recently to expand financial support for cattle producers to include the cow-calf and backgrounding sectors. While the Set-Aside program addresses the most urgent need facing our industry with reduced processing capacity in Alberta and across North America, cow-calf, and backgrounding producers are extremely worried about the markets that they will face this fall and the current depressed market for backgrounded cattle ready to go to a finishing feedlot. These producers need to be supported now, and our expanded funding proposal to the Alberta government request an amount similar to the Fed Cattle Set-Aside program be provided to reduce WLPIP premiums on contracts for calves and feeder cattle. The government of Saskatchewan is providing WLPIP premium relief for producers in their province, and we are asking the government of Alberta to provide support for Alberta producers. As we wait for a response, we encourage producers to contact government officials and express support for the expanded funding proposal. A producer letter to contact your MLA has been updated to reflect these requests and is available on the producer's homepage of albertabeef.org. We also have a letter available on our website that consumers can send to their government representatives. ABP and the Alberta Cattle Feeders Association recently put out a video of producers across Alberta thanking plant workers for processing our beef to keep feeding Canadians, and it is currently at over 36,000 views. Earlier this week, ABP also put up billboards near Cargill, JBS, and Harmony, thanking the workers at those plants. We felt those workers needed to know directly how much our industry relies on the work that they do. Our consumer-facing initiatives were adjusted to focus on commercial spots and increase social media, thanking those working hard to keep Albertans safe and that we are all in this together. Our updated educational resources were also launched early for parents and teachers to utilize while children are at home from school. As we work together to get through this pandemic, you can be confident that all of us at ABP are fighting to protect our interests as Alberta cattle and beef producers. ABP is working hard with all sectors of the industry to improve communications and understanding up and down the production chain. This collaboration will help us deal with the current market disruptions, approach governments with consistent and constructive requests, and position the beef industry to prosper into the future. Thanks, Dennis. That's all I have.
Thanks, Kelly. Michelle, I guess I'll maybe just, Rob, he got that same honor as Bob. He was lucky enough to become chair of the Beef Farmers of Ontario a few weeks before COVID started. Bob managed to do that on Friday the 13th in March. So Rob, if that's okay, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dennis. Everybody likes a challenge, I suppose. So I'd just like to say good evening to everybody from coast to coast. Introduce myself. I'm Rob Lipsett. I'm the beef producer from Grey County in Ontario and the current president of the Beef Farmers of Ontario. I'd like to thank Bob, Dennis, Kelly, Rick, and Michelle for sharing the so-called spotlight tonight and allowing Ontario to address the sector across the country on tonight's town hall. We believe if the current challenges are strategically addressed, the beef industry will emerge as a key recovery sector. The agriculture and food sectors have the potential to help kickstart our economy and quickly contribute to economic growth and jobs. But time is of the essence here. Our supply chains are becoming more precarious and volatile by the day. And many of our farm families are struggling to manage the financial losses and uncertainty that they are facing. The assistance programs that have been announced will not protect the financial viability of our farms or mitigate losses experienced at the farm gate. Farms can't simply borrow their way out of this crisis. While things could be worse in the East, the cattle sector and the COVID crisis have shown us that markets can turn in a hurry. The biggest problem we face is the lack of sufficient safety net programs available to protect us. If the market completely crashes, we will be left without sufficient protection. The lack of sufficient processing capacity has been another issue hampering the competitive position of the Eastern sector, a problem we've been facing for more than 2 years now. On our advocacy front, our messaging is mirrored that of CCA and groups like the NCFA. We've been working as a coalition in Eastern Canada to complement the work of our national organizations. In addition to advocacy efforts being done at the provincial level, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes have released a few statements calling for immediate assistance for the beef sector. And we launched a video a few weeks ago highlighting the urgency of the current situation, the threat to local food supply, and the viability of our farms. And we're proud to report that video has been viewed over 10,000 times. I'm as frustrated as I think many of you are across the country at the lack of action to date. We know that what has been announced will not address the problems our sector is facing. Governments across the country appear to be trying to make their solutions fit our problem. On the provincial side, we've advocated strongly for an increase in funding to the Ontario Risk Management Program. Similar to the calls for support of the Western Livestock Price Insurance Program in the West, the introduction of the program in the Maritimes, and support for Quebec's provincial program. In Ontario, a coalition of groups including the grains, pork, veal, sheep, and beef sectors have been jointly lobbying the government for RMP support. We've had meetings with our Premier's office and have a meeting with our Premier scheduled. Nothing is moving quick enough, and the finger-pointing exercise between governments is growing increasingly tiresome. The message we continue to receive is that government's preference is not to support regionally based programs. Programs like AgriStability that cover whole farm and are supported by both federal and provincial governments appear to be the government's stated preference. We feel there is movement on this front, but again, no real action to date, and we won't get into the limitations of some of those programs. On support that has been announced, the Ontario government has requested agri-recovery for the cattle sector to implement the Ontario portion of the set-aside program. It's unclear what the province's financial cap would be on this, but we do have a verbal commitment to move forward with an Ontario set-aside. I know our counterparts in Quebec are working on this as well. With fairly current cattle volumes in the province and across the east, we don't expect this would be used immediately. Unlike our colleagues in Western Canada, we have reinforced the message federally and provincially that having this tool available for Eastern Canada is important. If a disruption happens at any of our major plants in the east, or if the US is cut off further than what it already is, backlogs could build quickly. At this stage, it's not clear how long this program will be offered or when it will be implemented, but we're working with our provincial government on program details. In Ontario, we've requested that the program be kept available until at least the end of the fiscal year next March. Whether we see a disruption or slowdown in processing due to COVID or a second wave of cases, the backlog in processing trend we've seen the last few years in Eastern Canada may warrant having this tool ready to go for the fall, COVID-induced or not. On a positive note, prices in the East across all classes remain fairly strong, with fed cattle prices increasing over consecutive weeks, but losses are still mounting and relief is needed. On the processing front, there's been a lot of rumors and social media activity regarding the possible reopening of the former Riding Regency plant in Toronto. We can confirm the license application has been submitted by a new management team under a new name and is currently under review by CFIA. An initial site inspection took place the week of May 3rd, with a second occurring the following week, which is positive. The management team is currently working to address some of the items that were flagged by the inspection team during their initial visits. I do want to stress caution about assuming any false expectations. While we're pleased that progress is being made to bring additional processing capacity online and hopeful that a license will be granted, it's simply too soon and too uncertain to discuss opening timelines. What we know about slaughter facility approvals is that the licensing process can take time. Despite the need for additional capacity and the urgency to get a new license issued, corners can't be cut in this process. With that said, BFO has urged AAFC and CFIA to expedite this review process. Hopefully some positive news will be able to be shared regarding this facility sometime in the near future. As far as Ontario and the East goes, processing capacity continues to exceed 100%, which is very good news. And I'd like to offer a big thank you to the frontline workers and management at Cargill, St. Helens, Atlantic Beef, Norwich Packers, and all the other federal and provincial plants across the East, and all of those across Canada, ensuring that cattle and meat continue to move as efficiently as possible. We've seen some minor disruptions at provincial plants in Ontario, which have since been resolved, and the Cargill-Chambly further processing plant in Quebec was down for a brief time, but has resumed operations. All things considered, the situation in the East is manageable from a volume perspective, but support for market losses remains unaddressed and certainly needed. We do know some Western fats have moved to Ontario. With no backlog here, we would expect Alberta to do the same if we were in their position and they were in ours. We don't have to look too far back for examples of this. This past fall, Ontario cattle moved west during the backlog that was caused by the loss of the Riding Regency plant. And the growing trend of surges in volume during peak times of the year has led to backlogs at processing, an issue that is becoming more frequent and severe in the East, even prior to COVID. In closing, what I can say is that the level of coordination I've seen across the country to come together as a sector, an industry, and across sectors and industry has been unprecedented. While actions speak louder than words or meetings, we're putting everything we have into our efforts to deliver for the industry. I thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back to Dennis.
Thanks, Rob. I guess, Michelle, we're ready for questions. So we've got a team here as well who are able to help support the answer of various questions that'll come forward. So, Michelle?
So thanks for that. Thanks, Rick, Dennis, Kelly, and Rob for your updates. Before we open the floor to questions, as Dennis noted, we do have additional representatives from the industry available to take questions. We have Fawn Jackson, Director of Government and International Relations at CCA, Janice Tranberg, President of the National Cattle Feeders Association, Rich Smith, Executive Director at ABP, Richard Horn, Executive Director at BFO, and Michael Young, President of Canada Beef. So if you have any questions for them, please submit them as well. We also have CCA staff helping respond to questions by text. Please include your name and province with your question. We will now be taking questions. Please type your question using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. And I'll start with the first question, and this one is from Gordon. With the stronger demand and prices for fed cattle, is there still a need for a set aside on fats? Why?
Michelle, I wonder, Jan, you're on. We had that discussion this week. Did you want to answer that?
Sure, I can take a stab at it. I mean, I think the first point really is that we don't know where the prices are going. We've seen an increase this week, and let's hope it continues, but we don't know where that's going to go in the future. So to get a program, similar to what Rob said, to get a program up and running and ready is not a bad thing regardless. And then we're also estimating that there will be a peak as the summer months come and more animals are moved into the packing process or the processing facilities. This backlog is not going to go away anytime soon. So to be able to have a program to allow producers to enter in is what we're working on. Maybe Dennis, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think, clearly with what we saw in the market here right now, there's a feeling maybe as we get towards later in June and July, that may be when we start to get into heavier volumes. We're in the calves, they can be stretched out further, but at some point, that backlog is going to start to weigh in the market again. And the feeling is we need to be nimble so that if come, early July, we need to start looking at that inventory. We've got the tool to do it.
Thanks, Dennis and Janice. Our next question is from Morgan. Will WLPIC LPIP be a trade irritant under the USMCA, given what's coming out of the US? Would any premium subsidy be countervailable? Yes, the usual cast of characters might be watching closely.
I guess maybe I can take a run at that. I've been involved in countervail cases in the past. And first of all, hi, Morgan. How are you doing? With any of these premiums, if there's a government payout. Now, what I will say is certainly south of the border, there's a lot more support actually being given to their industry right now than is being made available to our industry. That said, the Department of Commerce doesn't have to take that into account if there is a countervailing duty. But the actual level of the amount and the fact that, you know, our overall live cattle exports have been trending down, you end up with a few areas of defense around this. It's a small amount relatively speaking. And then the second part is when you get into the injury arguments, a very small payment against a small and declining number of cattle usually give us a pretty strong basis to build a successful argument that we're not causing any injury. That certainly worked last time if you go back into the 90s when we were able both to demonstrate de minimis, but also then when we got to anti-dumping, the fact that our live cattle exports were not causing any injury. So we're looking at that, but you know, at this stage, with the nature of the risks facing producers, generally we've been given direction to pursue that matching premium.
Thanks for that, Dennis. Our next question is from Brent, and he's asking if there is a timeline on details for the set-aside program.
I want Janice or Rich.
Maybe I can just start. I mean, remember that each of the set-asides are going to be provincially administered. So it really is up to each province to determine that. I think that there's a discussion going on in each of the province. I'm not sure that those decisions have been 100% made at this point in time. Rich, do you want to add?
Well, I think you're right. There's ongoing discussions and work on the actual development of the program. We're hopeful that government will continue to work with industry on the details of the program to make sure it's as effective as possible. But that is taking some time, and so they haven't given us an exact time of when they will have the program details available. But obviously, they're working to have it done as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to sit in on those discussions, and I think the great thing is right now with the way the market is working right now, you know, the discussion is let's make sure it's done well and done right so you get the desired impact. So I think there's a really thoughtful discussion going into the program design, and I've been impressed with the dialogue that's going on in Alberta. I know if you ask that question to Rob in Eastern Canada, you know, I think there's a sense things are current, but as we head, as you mentioned, that increase in inventory that comes typically towards late fall, early winter. So that's maybe when you'll see the set aside in another part of the country begin to become useful to implement. So.
Thanks for those responses. Our next question comes from Jill, and her question is, can the large packers in Canada speed up the line, lessen the backlog of cattle by changing the line to only cut meat destined for hamburger and sending those cuts to grinding facilities such as Fruit Grove in Edmonton, the McDonald's facility? Perhaps the packers could alternate weeks of only producing hamburger for 1 week at a time and then the next back to normal harvest.
I wonder if Michael Young, did you want to?
I can Dennis.
Chip in, but yeah, Michael.
Okay, so as far as I know, commercial harvesting processes for grinding operations, it's a priority for the meat processing sector in Canada. I believe the processors are focusing on optimizing throughput and yields to meet the demands in the marketplace. I do know that many lean end cuts are being utilized in this way now to help meet the strong demand for ground beef. Essentially, the processes required for removing bones are as complex, actually more complex than cutting it into basic primal cuts. So, again, this is a commercial decision made by the processors who are, managing this business. So I do believe they're working very hard. I know with the packers getting up to higher volumes, there definitely is supply in the system now. I've seen a noted change in product assortments in Western Canada just in this last week. So hopefully supply will catch up with demand, and we can get back to supplying 100% Canadian beef to all of our retail and food service partners.
And Michael, you might want to comment briefly. There's been one of the things that the plants are doing are producing some more bone-in cuts where they, under normal conditions, they would be trimming them down and boning them out. And so a number of the customers at the retail are now dealing with different cuts. They're obviously cuts historically that we used to produce, but it's kind of moved some of the labor out of the fabrication line and to those butcher counters or those butcher areas behind the counter in retail stores. And you guys have been really dialing in to work with them on with the retailers on merchandising those products.
Yes. Yeah, that's actually been going on since the beginning. A lot of the retailers have been offered what we call commodity cuts or rougher cuts, or sometimes Quebec specs. There's different names for it, but basically they are larger bone-in subprimals that require less labor at the plant and more labor at the retail sector. So they are out there. We are providing training materials in terms of, in fact, we've shot over the last 2 weeks 9 videos on cutting some of these cuts that are instructional, just for retail partners who are doing this sort of thing. And we'll continue to provide those resources. We don't know when this might change, so we want to have the tools in the box ready to go. But that is helping with getting some of the product cleared and freeing up some of the labor at the packing house level, Dennis. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Michael. Our next question is from Douglas. You keep talking about a backlog. How do you really know if this is so? Or is it like oil where there was supposedly no storage capacity and a month later there was a huge drawdown in inventory? Second question, how long are cattle being held back for? Is this causing another problem because the finished weights are creeping up?
I guess I'll maybe start on that, and Dave, you may want to, Dave Moss, if I know you're responding, typing to other questions, but one of the things that we're seeing is, I think and Rick kind of mentioned this earlier, we're at a stage where the calves now are starting to enter into the, they're finished through on their feeding and ready to go to slaughter, and we're cleaning up the last of the yearlings or the larger animals, and there's been a real priority to get those remaining yearlings processed here, which are the really large animals that we're dealing with. With the yearlings, you can certainly stretch them out further, and Bob can talk about that, or Michelle, in terms of how they're dealing with that. So you can deal with that inventory over a longer period of time, but at some point in time we are accumulating more of those that will come likely this summer, as was mentioned earlier. And the reality to some degree is until you empty a pen, you don't refill it. So there is a capacity of cattle that are out there, but we're going to have a lot more market ready cattle coming at the same time, instead of cattle that would be planned weeks out as a rule, to make sure we've got the 52-week kill. With the set aside, that is still under discussion, the number of weeks that we would potentially try and set those aside, and really want to depend on an expert industry committee to weigh in on that decision, that second question about how long are they held back for, and trying to make sure it doesn't cause a problem. With the finished weights, we want to make sure you get the right cattle going to market at the right time. And I will say that what we did here this week is the processors are really dialing in on the animals that need to get processed. In fact, I heard from 1 or 2 feeders where they'd sent some that were not as heavy, that they were told, we want to get rid of the animals that need to get slaughtered, so don't do that again until we're ready to pull those animals. So there is a genuine effort, in addition to set aside, just generally to manage the cattle that are going through. But Bob, do you want to comment a bit about the yearlings and versus the calves and feeding them?
Sure, Dennis. And I'll speak from personal experience. We, on our yearlings, a lot of them that were supposed to go 6 weeks ago are finally starting to move now. So you can put them on a low energy diet, which it's designed, the one we use is designed so that they don't grow, period. And this time of year, they're going to grow a little bit anyway, just to hold the weight. Our calves that are just coming up right now, some of them could be shipped right now, but they can go, you can put another 60 or 70 days on them if you have to without hurting them. And a little bit of an example of what happens when you get overweight, so I saw that in your question, is we shipped some 1,800 pound plus cattle last week. And of course, that's overweight by anybody's guess. If you take the market today, what Rick told us the market today was, and you take that on a 1,500 pound animal, he's worth about $600 a head more than we got for the 1,800 pound animals last week. And you've got the cost of putting the feed in to gain another 300 pounds to lose 600 pounds. It's that's where this is really becoming a problem, or has become a big problem. Does that kind of answer you, Dennis?
Yeah, I think so. It's it's a question of, fortunately we're moving into these the calves that were put on feed last fall, and we're able, we can stretch them out further right now. So it's, even goes back to that earlier question about when's the right time to look at possibly using the set aside to manage or balance out versus the number that we're able to process.
Thanks, Dennis and Bob. Our last question for this evening is for Michael Young. I appreciate and endorse the actions of Canada Beef to broaden the utilization of the carcass, but my question is really, why are we so complacent about the large margins and increased margins since the commencement of COVID-19, and yet live animal prices were suppressed, if not reduced?
I could take a stab at that. I don't really have an answer. There is, there are substantial costs that were bore by the meat processors in terms of equipment changes, procedures, slowdowns, closures. And that's just the meat processing side of it. On the retail side of it, they've got the same expenses creating their operations. So I don't really have an answer directly to, what can we do about that gap right now. I know we're focusing on trying to straighten out the demand and the product assortments that's out there now, to try to bring some kind of balance back into place, and to try to, in turn, try to get some of the costs down to the consumers. Right now, we're being told that the higher prices and temporary out of stocks are not affecting their habits, which I'm quite surprised. They apparently, if something's not there today, they'll buy something else. They are buying a lot of cuts that they're not used to buying, which is great. So I don't really have much else to add to that. Dennis, do you have anything to top that one up with?
Well, I mean, we're certainly having discussions, about that. Clearly, in the short term, getting the plants up and running to full capacity. And they literally are spending millions of dollars with changes to those operations to try and make sure they're as COVID resilient as they can. And we were hearing just the amount they're going to spend on visors alone every day for their employees and masks are all, are going to be extraordinary costs here for a while. So, we're going to be going through a period of time here that's unlike anything we've seen before. Clearly the first and most important priority is to get as much processing so we can get as much competitive bidding as we possibly can. And, obviously continuing to keep the border open. At the end of the day, competitive bidding is obviously one of the key parts of all of this. But we are, I know Janice and the National Cattle Feeders were having discussions about having a broad industry. We're going to want to sit down together and talk about these issues and try and look at the path forward around them.
Thanks for that, Dennis and Michael. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions this evening. Before we close tonight's meeting, I'd like to open the floor to Bob and Michelle for closing comments.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I guess in closing, I'd like to really thank Kelly and Rob for coming in and giving us the provincial rundown of what's going on. And we're into branding, and I've mentioned this before, and it should be mentioned again. The provincial associations have developed COVID-approved branding proposals, I guess is how I'd put it. And we have those available on the website. And we can't express, Rob mentioned it tonight, our thanks to all the industry partners. It has really brought all of agriculture together into one room and heading in the same direction, which is something that I've never seen before. And I'd like to thank the packers for their continued innovation and getting the ball moving, getting rolling, and in particular the employees in the packing plants. It's been shown that if they aren't there, we suffer pretty badly. So their work is essential, and we can't thank them enough. Michelle?
Yes, finally, maybe some positive news. I share with Rob Lipset the special thanks to Eastern Processors for their increasing over 100% capacity before. Their bids on cattle shows that we have less backlog now in the eastern part of the country. Thank you, every cattle feeder, to stay patient and resilient. You are doing your job very well, Maintenant, en français. Alors, quelques peut-être bonnes nouvelles en terminant. Alors, pendant que les opérateurs canadiens améliorent leur capacité d'abattage et de transformation, je dois dire un merci spécial à Cargill Guelph, par exemple, qui a redoublé d'efforts pendant que son plan de découpe à Chambly au Québec a dû fermer ses portes temporairement à cause de la COVID chez les employés. Un merci spécial aussi à St. Helens Mills Toronto, Norwich Parker, l'abattoir Forgette, l'abattoir Richelieu, Atlantic Beef dans les maritimes. Tous ces abattoirs-là ont augmenté significativement leur capacité d'abattage et d'autres petits abattoirs aussi dans l'Est. Alors, ça fait la différence. On souhaite qu'il n'y ait pas de plan qui tombe là, sous les épidémies de COVID et on devrait venir à bout là, du report d'animaux qui est en retard d'abattage. Alors, les cotes qu'on reçoit actuellement pour les bovins ont une amélioration très importante là, qui m'indique qu'actuellement, il y a beaucoup moins d'animaux en attente pour être abattus. Alors, merci à chaque éleveur canadien de rester patient, résilient. Vous savez qu'à la fin, vous avez toujours bien fait le travail et vous continuez de le faire et bravo à vous tous.
Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight's town hall. There will be a short survey when you exit tonight's meeting. We would ask that you complete the survey and provide us with important feedback for future virtual town hall meetings. If you have any follow-up questions or would like to request a recording of the town hall, please email me at mcmullenm@cattle.ca. Thank you and stay healthy. Merci et prenez soin de vous.